So I'm going to start with a couple of slides, just sort of framing, explaining some concepts about the finance curse. And the first one is really this simple picture here. Can you all see that? Yeah. So the basic idea is that finance is useful. We all need finance. We need it to, get money out at the ATMs, to finance small businesses, whatever. But that there is also a part of the financial sector, and I'm coming very much from a UK perspective, even though I live in Germany, I'm British, where the financial sector is very large, that there is a large section of the financial sector which is harmful, and it is dedicated more to extracting wealth than to creating it. So it's kind of like inside there's a good part and outside there's a bad part. I don't think anybody would disagree with that picture. Certainly not in the UK, and I imagine not in Iceland either. So that's the first way of looking at it. Another way of framing it is this kind of paradox. What happens is you have this useful core of finance. Countries that don't have enough finance, whose financial sectors are too small, maybe can help themselves by developing their financial sector until it's a kind of optimal size. But once you get beyond that optimal size, then it starts to turn harmful. And I'll show you some evidence of that later. So there's this kind of countries whose financial sectors are above a certain size. For them, too much finance makes us poorer. So it's kind of paradox. It's kind of surprising. And it's very difficult in the UK, certainly, to get this message across, because so many people think the City of London, our financial sector, brings in money, it makes us rich, and we need to protect it. And the second part of the finance curse is why, the reason why does too much finance make us poorer? There are actually several reasons, but the biggest one is this concept of wealth extraction, financial sector players extracting wealth from other parts of the economy, damaging the overall economy. Here's another way of thinking about it. A lot of people think that the financial sector just transmits all sorts of harm. It may be true, but the finance curse concept is more restricted than that. A tax haven, which is the subject of my previous book, the financial sector in a tax haven transmits harm outwards to other countries. So it's a sort of international effect. And that's very important, but that is not the subject of the finance curse. The finance curse is restricted to the domestic economy. And that is, an oversized financial sector transmits harm inwards to the host country. And the reason that I separate that out is because it's such an important political message. Politics is local. And if we are saying this hurts us, that is often a much more powerful recipe for reform than if we say this hurts them, this hurts poorer countries and things like that. So it is very useful to think in these more restricted terms. So this kind of develops what I was just saying. So, a standard critique of tax havens, if we're worried about tax havens, and the UK is very much a center of tax haven activity. Not only the UK in its own right has some tax haven aspects, but it also runs a network of tax havens around the world, British overseas territories and crown dependencies, such as Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Jersey. And so a poor country, LIC here means low income country, may say, you tax haven, you are harming us. And the tax haven authorities might say, we don't care. The money comes in, it makes us rich. Or someone in a rich country might say, our tax haven activity hurts poor countries. And in the rich country, people will say, well, the money comes in, it brings money into us, so we get rich, so that's okay. It's a recipe for either doing nothing or actually supporting the tax haven activity. But the finance curse critique changes this frame, and it says this tax haven activity bringing money in hurts us in a whole range of ways, and that is a very different political message to get across. The standard solutions to tax havens are that countries have an incentive to cheat. We may not like tax haven activity, but if we try and if countries often say, you hear politicians all the time in the UK saying, well, if we stop doing this, then the money will just go somewhere else. So we better carry on doing it. And so it's really difficult to get. The answer traditionally is, okay, we need collective international collaborations. We need the OECD to come together and make an international system and try and stop everybody cheating. But still, you know, countries do feel they have the incentive to cheat and be tax havens. Voters are often not interested. It's hard to get people interested in you know, complicated international collaborations with the OECD. And so you get this kind of race to the bottom, countries trying to outdo each other to be tax havens, you know, to grow their financial sector by attracting tax haven money, by attracting dirty money or corporate tax avoiding money or whatever. So the finance curse kind of framing changes this dynamic. Countries can act unilaterally. They realize if it's their own self-interest to stop being tax havens, to stop trying to grow their financial sector, that can change the whole dynamic, and countries can say, we can do this in our own self-interest, we can stop this game, and we will actually be better off for it. Now, I should stress at this stage that I've been talking a lot about tax havens. Tax haven activity is just one aspect of our financial sector. There are various other aspects, of course, to our financial sector, which also are relevant here. Now, a little bit of history here. So how did the finance curse concept come about? Well, it started with John Christensen, who was the main founder of the Tax Justice Network, contacted me in 2006. I'd just been writing this book, Poisoned Wells, about oil in Africa, and about this so-called resource curse, where some countries, at least, which produce natural resources like oil, tend not only to be not harnessing those resources for development, you know, the elites kind of steal them and, you know, the resources don't get developed. But in some cases, and this is certainly true when I was living in Angola, it's even worse than that. You are made poorer by all this oil. Angola's civil war that I was covering at the time was substantially a result of its natural resource dependence. There were lots of other reasons for the civil war, but that was probably the biggest in terms of motivation and duration and ferocity. So this natural resource, all this money, again, it's this concept of too much money makes you poorer. And that was certainly the case in Angola. It's not the case for all countries that produce oil, of course. I mean, it would be much harder to make a resource curse argument for Norway, for example, which seems to have been much better at harnessing its oil money for national development. But Christensen contacted me and he said, we started talking about this stuff. I was talking about the resource curse, and he said, I'm seeing very similar things in Jersey. So he was the economic advisor at the time to the British tax haven of Jersey before he set up the Tax Justice Network. He was on the other side, and he was trying to develop Jersey, this little tax haven, with a population, I can't remember, 50,000 people or something like that. And he was finding it very, very difficult. I mean, he was very conscious when he was there that the financial sector was damaging other parts of the country. For example, all the best educated, you know, cleverest, most talented people were being sucked out of agriculture, sucked out of tourism, sucked out of all the other sectors into finance. There was also huge volatility. I mean, you know, in Angola's case, oil prices, you know, from $10 a barrel up to $150 a barrel and back, complete havoc with economic policy making. Well, it was similar in Jersey, where finance was so dominant in the economy. When the global financial crisis came, it was the damage was much greater. Similarly in the UK. So there's various other factors. It's not just extraction that are causing damage. For time reasons, I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm going to show you now it's a kind of impressionistic slide. This is something that John and I made a little while back. And this is from the United Nations. It's a particular measure called GNI per capita rank minus human development rank. And what it really shows you is how well countries are turning their national income into human development, into, you know, life expectancy at birth and things like that. So how well are they harnessing this wealth? Now this is not a very scientific table, but it is, as far as impressions go, it's very powerful. The ones at the bottom in black, these are the ones that have been quite successful in developing in turning, you know, their level of income into human development. And the ones at the top, the yellow ones are the mostly oil producing countries, the resource rich countries, and the red ones are finance dependent countries. So there does seem to be, again, this kind of problematic element of both oil and finance, which in many cases are similar. Now, sorry, the biggest difference really is in what academics call financialization. Is this the term that people are, how familiar are people with this term financially? It's something that in the UK, most academics know about and most people in the street don't know about. So do I need to talk a bit more about financialization? But I'll just give a very quick overview. It's essentially the, as finance comes to dominate, financial techniques, financial institutions, financial methods tend to take over other parts of the economy, from manufacturing to agriculture to technology, whatever. Increasingly, everything is seen through financial lenses. And this financialization, the result is financial players, as I mentioned earlier, are able to extract money from other parts of the economy. So this is not productive financial activity, this is extractive financial activity. And this, again, this concept of extraction is really central to the finance curse. But the difference with an oil producing country is that the wealth is really extracted from the ground, from the environment. And with finance, it's extracted from other parts of the economy, from our pockets, you might say. So this is the sort of concept of the finance curse. Now, I'm going to illustrate this with, again, reference to the UK, and I do not know how significant this would be for Iceland. I'd be interested to hear what people's thoughts on this. But this is, how does this play out in regional terms, in geographical terms, inside a country? Again, I'm not talking internationally, I'm talking inside a country. So in Britain, there is this widespread belief that London is the engine of the British economy. We must protect the city of London. When I say London, I mean the financial sector in London. We must protect the city of London. We must protect finance. This is the one that pays all our taxes, that delivers all the prosperity. And I tried playing this earlier, but I don't think it will work now, this YouTube video. Anyway, I think many of you will recognize this man. This is Boris Johnson, our current Prime Minister. He was speaking about 8 or 9 years ago when he was the Mayor of London. And essentially what he was saying was, you will create, he said, the words he used were, you will create jobs in Strathclyde, which is a place in Scotland, and actually it's an administrative region that was abolished many years ago. But you will create jobs in Scotland by investing in London. Again, this idea of London as the engine of the economy. You treat the engine well, and all this wealth will kind of flow out to the rest of the country and help the country. And so in my book, I took this quote from Johnson, and I looked for, there's a government website that has a list of companies. These are the public-private partnerships where the government doesn't invest in these things. This is a police training center. This is the picture you can see here. The government doesn't directly commission and pay for these police training centers. What it does is it signs a contract with financial players and say, okay, you build the police training center, you finance it, you raise the money, and then we'll pay you a series of payments over the next 25 years to pay it off. And it's a great way for the government not to have to borrow a lot of money. It's kind of outsourcing borrowing to the financial sector, and it enabled the government to say, look, we're not busting the bank by borrowing. But in fact, this is a very, very controversial area, public-private partnerships and private finance initiative. And again, I'd be interested to hear how the experience has been in Iceland. So I looked for this term Strathclyde, and I found a company called Strathclyde Limited Partnership. And it was this company that was commissioned to build this police training center. And I had a look at this. I think Halla has probably seen this because I showed this picture in Austin. So how much did this police training center cost to build? Well, it was about, let's say, £20 million. And if you were to take normal financing costs into this, you'd end up with maybe 30 to 50 million pounds. That's how much it would cost if the government issued a bond and borrowed that much money and repaid the bond with interest. So you'd end up paying about 30 to 45 million over the 25 years of this project. There would have been some operating costs, but they don't provide those. But it wouldn't be enormous. But you compare this 20 million or so of actual cost of construction to the actual payments that are outlined in the official government figures, and it's 5 to 7 times as much. Massive difference between what it actually costs to build and what the government is going to be paying these financial players. So the private finance initiative has been described as one hospital for the price of two. It is very, people in Britain now, I think, are very conscious of this. It has been a disaster, but it is an example of the financialization of the economy. And of course, it raises a big question. Where did all the difference go? The difference between what it cost to build, or what it should have cost to build, and what it actually cost to build. So I started looking for where the money might have gone. And I started with, here we go at the bottom. Here's the police training centre at the bottom. And that's owned by Strathclyde Limited Partnership. That's that company that I was looking at earlier. So who owns that? And then you get some other companies. You don't need to kind of try and understand all this. Just look at the number of companies that own this, okay? So you get to the top here, and you get another thing called IPP Investments Limited Partnership, which of course raises the question, who owns that? Okay, so who owns that? You get all these companies, IPP Bond Limited going upwards, another whole structure of companies, until eventually you get to the top of this tower, and you get this company called Amber Infrastructure Holdings Limited. Well, that raises the next question, who owns Amber Infrastructure Holdings Limited? Okay, that's owned by another set of companies. And then you have some shareholders coming in, and some Estera Trust in Jersey, and a Luxembourg company. But also the majority shareholder is Hunt Amber London 2 Limited. So then you ask, who owns that? And then you just keep going up. And eventually you get this large American company called Hunt Companies Inc. in El Paso, Texas. So the reason I show you this is just to show the complexity. And this is kind of like, for me, it's like a picture of financialization. All these companies serve a financial purpose. Generally, when you get structures like this, the purpose is to separate risk from reward. In other words, these people at the top want to use this structure to remove as much risk as possible from this structure, and to maximize the reward that they get from this. And they essentially, there's a lot of debt, there's a lot of borrowing coming in at different levels of this structure that help juice up the returns, increase the profits. But then they use limited liability laws to make sure that if this company somehow collapses, that they are protected. The collapse will not affect them. They won't lose their money. It'll be the creditors, it'll be other people who lose their shirts. So they want to take kind of, they want to get maximum rewards for the minimum of risk. And it's really a corruption of capitalism. This is not what, if you support capitalism, you would be revolted by this, because this is not how it's worked. Risk and reward are supposed to go together. But here, this is a structure for allowing these people to make enormous amounts of money with little or no risk. And so this is why these big companies tend to buy up as many companies as they can across, because it's kind of like rolling or flipping a coin. When you buy one of these things, either it does well, in which case you get rich, or it collapses, in which case you don't lose anything. But there's basically no loss to be had. They put up tiny little bits of equity in these things. And so this is how financial capitalism, this is probably the central secret, is getting rewards with minimum risk, putting the risk onto other people's shoulders, putting the risk onto government shoulders, putting it onto workers' shoulders. And I'm actually involved in making a film about this, and we recently interviewed a woman in Britain who was running a nursery for providing childcare, and she was just saying she was so tired of all these investors coming in from the City of London offering millions just for this little childcare company, because they know they can buy this company and they can just financially engineer it. They will take a company and they'll say, hasn't put its tax affairs into tax havens enough. Let's do that. Let's do that and get the taxes down. Let's, it's paying its workers too much. It's the pension pot is too generous. Let's do something. Let's break the unions. Let's, all these kind of things increase the cash flow, and then they can borrow some more money and make even more money. So it is really a corruption of capitalism. And one of the sort of interesting things about this whole area, I think, is that this is not, I hope you're kind of horrified and annoyed by this, and I don't suppose it would surprise anybody, that this kind of structure. But I think it's something that can easily unite people across the political spectrum from left to right, whatever that means these days. But I mean, people worried about inequality will be horrified by this, but also people worried about the integrity of markets and about corruption should also be horrified by this. And I think looking at things this way and through the perspective of rigged markets, I think allows us to think about political coalitions that are not the obvious, not the usual suspects. I think, small businesses and trade unions, for example, have a lot in common in terms of shared interest in tackling this kind of stuff. And in the UK, this stuff is routine. This is how things are done. These structures are all over the place if you start looking for them. I mean, it's a little hobby of mine. When I'm feeling I need a break from my normal work, I find a company and I look. You can go, there's quite a good corporate registry, and you can look, who owns this, and then you find another one and you keep going. That was a particularly elaborate one. They're not all as elaborate as that. But anyway, so back to geography. Boris Johnson was saying London is the engine of the UK economy. The tax revenues and the spending come out of London and flow to the other place. They flow to Scotland, flow to Strathclyde. So they paint this sort of City of London focused, finance-friendly view, which is very popular in the UK, is that money, the finance sector, all these rich people are creating jobs and sending the wealth to the rest of the country. But this structure here is completely different. The wealth is flowing in exactly the opposite direction. It is flowing from Strathclyde, from Scottish police budgets in this case, into London. And so you have this whole, London, if you look at it this view, it is a kind of wealth extraction machine from the other regions, because the winners are in London or central London, and also offshore in tax havens and overseas and in El Paso, Texas in this case. And the losers are in the regions where all these activities are, the coalface of this, the big elderly care or childcare companies are operating all across British regions, and the people who are making a lot of money out of it are in, this sort of London nexus. And the people who are being paid terrible wages and local authorities being screwed by all these different techniques are out in the regions, and also in poorer parts of London as well. So there's a very important geographical issue to this, and it happens across many dimensions of the economy. How are we doing for time? Probably another 5 minutes. Is that okay? 5 or 10 minutes? Okay. Am I going too quickly, by the way, or is this okay? This okay, all right. So there are various ways in which finance extracts from the regions. One is, and I believe this is a subject that is woefully is not well understood in Europe, and across this side of the Atlantic. There is a lot of exciting stuff going on in the United States about monopolization, but I think we are all, across this side of the Atlantic, and certainly in Britain, there is an absolute complacency among all across civil society about this. I think monopolization is as big, if not bigger, than tax havens. And in this geographical case, it's a centralizing force. You create a monopoly that you can extract from consumers or workers or whoever in other parts of the country, and you realize the extra profits in London or the London nexus, which also is offshore. Too big to fail banking is the same thing, and that's something that Icelanders, I think, will be very familiar with, privatizing gains, and the gains are privatized again in this London nexus, and the losses are socialized much more widely. Tax haven activity as well. The gains go to a relatively small number of people, but the spending losses from tax haven activity and all the associated economic volatility and financial stability issues that are associated with the tax havens which is another subject for another day, those hit the regions hardest because government spending gets cut when we had the last global financial crisis, and I guess maybe something similar is going to happen now. Private equity firms are specializing in extraction. That is kind of the core of private equity, is what I would call identifying all the stakeholders. They buy up a company and then identify all the stakeholders of that company: the government, the taxpayer, the workers, the suppliers, the consumers, and they will work out strategies for extracting maximum wealth from those groups. And again, it has this powerful geographical impact. And of course, this has immense political effects. And if you have people, I think most people in Britain, and I imagine in most countries, feel that there is a real divide between the winners, the extractors, who are benefiting from these rigged, corrupted markets, and the losers, who are just losing out from it. I think, a lot of huge numbers of Trump voters, huge numbers of Brexit voters in the UK are, they may not know the details of it, they may not understand how it works, but they know that they're being ripped off. And, this is a recipe for political polarization and all sorts of terrible trends that we're seeing. What's happening, particularly since 2016 across the world, this sort of new world we're in. And again, this is just a kind of impressionistic picture, but here we have a picture in the UK of Remain voters. They're kind of in the winners section, and Leave voters more in the losers section. It's not a very close correlation, but it's good enough, I think. And similarly in the United States, they talk about the coastal elites in the United States. Well, again, the coastal elites voted against Trump, and the more provincial parts of the United States voted for Trump. So geography was just an illustration of a very important aspect of the finance curse. But in fact, you can make the same arguments for any vulnerable, weak populations. Women will tend to be harmed by this more than men are. People of color, people with disabilities, anyone sort of disadvantaged will tend to be at the wrong end of the finance curse. And there'll be, the large majority of people will be at the wrong end. There will be some winners always. So that's the story about redistribution. This redistributes wealth upwards. But does this add up to a finance curse, as in, so we've redistributed the pie, but does it make the pie smaller? That's a separate question. And there is now so much evidence that it's irrefutable. Here's the International Monetary Fund. Again, this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. If you look at this graph on the left, this is the idea of finance needs to grow to support your economy up to a certain point. But once you reach that optimal point, if you continue to grow further, it will start to reduce economic growth. And there are lots of this kind of banana-shaped curve out there with different measures of financial sector. This is the Bank for International Settlements, the sort of central bank's bank. That's a study of them. This is the OECD. Here's another study showing that changes in expansion in finance is good up to a point, and then after that point it starts to turn harmful. So there are lots and lots of studies out there. And again, I don't think we've got time to talk about all the reasons for that, but we've sort of covered it already. The brain drain into the other sectors, the Dutch disease, which is a phenomenon when you have large inflows of money into your country, it kind of raises local price levels and makes it harder for local tradable sectors, manufacturing or agriculture or whatever, to compete with imports. And so now I just want to finish off by again kind of repeating this political story. In Britain, there's this widespread belief if we must protect the financial sector. People think if we tax it too much and regulate it too much, we're going to lose jobs and tax revenues, and we'll be poorer. So we can't. So it's a kind of, people don't like deregulating finance. They don't like cutting taxes on big banks. But on the other hand, they think, well, it's going to make us poorer. So there's this kind of ambivalent attitude. and people don't really know where to go with it. It's very confusing whether your financial sector is, what to do about it. And people are terrified of doing anything to harm this, what they call the goose that lays the golden eggs. But the finance curse, if, I'm trying to sort of popularize this concept, if more finance makes you poorer, then it's pretty simple. If you want to be more prosperous as a country, you shrink the financial sector. And if we go back to that very first slide, this one, again, you just shrink the red part and keep the good part. That's what you really want to do. And the way to do that is to tackle all the wealth extraction and all these games that are going on. And you will end up with a smaller financial sector, but your country will not only be more equal, there'll be less kind of extraction and anger going on, but you will also have a more kind of your economy there'll be more prosperity. You'll have a better economy. So this is a kind of validation of, I think, what I think many people kind of know in their gut, but it's again a complex question. Things like progressive taxation, stronger financial regulation, stronger criminal laws, stronger enforcement of criminal laws, environmental laws, crackdowns on tax havens and things like that. All of these things, which in the popular imagination in Britain tend to be confusing people, these things are actually helpful rather than harmful. So this really helps, I think, open up political discussions for the possibility of change much more than before. So that's kind of my pitch. I hope it's relevant for people in Iceland. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.